Hi, I'm Jean Berkenbush. I live in West Newbury at 19 Chestnut Lane, and I've lived here for 43 years. And as a baby, I lived in another section of West Newbury. So I'd like to talk about my roots because my roots have always been in Newbury, and West Newbury and Newburyport were part of Newbury. But in 1635, two brothers, their last names was Knight, landed here, and they ended up with farms on Rogers Street in West Newbury. The two farms are across from each other, number 51 and 52 Rogers Street. And they, one of those farms has stayed in a direct descendant of the Knight brothers. And the one across the street from it, which is number 52 Rogers Street, I am a descendant of that Knight family. And the reason I mention this is because the farm went out of the family, the Knight family, and my grandfather, Prescott Spaulding, and his wife, Margaret, who was a Knight, ended up buying the farm in 1929. So this farm is where my father grew up, and there were some interesting stories about the farm. One thing was my dad, when he was only 6 years old, he was sitting on a grain bin in the barn of this farm. And there was a storm coming. My grandfather was leading his workhorse into the barn, and lightning struck the rail of the barn door. It split in two, and my father was struck and the horse. My father was nearly killed. My grandfather quickly grabbed him and brought him to his truck. His neighbor, Charlie Rogers, lived in the other farmhouse I talked about. He jumped in with my grandfather and dashed off to the Anna Jakes Hospital. They got there. My grandfather jumped out of the truck. He didn't even turn it off, and carried my father into the hospital. My dad was in a coma for over a week. And there was a story, I read it once, I haven't seen the paper since, but it was in the local Newburyport newspaper about this. And he did survive, obviously. But years later, Charlie Rogers' daughter, Lois Rogers, told me how Charlie had to stop the truck because my grandfather was so upset. He jumped out without even turning it off. And after she told me that story, I told my grandfather, and he never realized that he remembered Charlie being there, but he never realized Charlie jumped in and stopped the car for him. But my dad did recover. He was only 6 when he was struck by lightning.
So what year was that if he was 6?
It would have been 1930, and it happened when he was at the farm.
Amazing that there was a vehicle nearby that they could get to
Well,
put him in to get to Anna Jakes.
Well, remember, it was a working farm.
Yeah.
I mean, they had trucks.
Yeah.
They had to.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But he was only 6, and I can remember my grandmother telling me that she said to me one time that she was always thought that my father wouldn't live to grow up because he had so many bad things happen to him. Another time, he was just a kid still, he was walking across the living room and collapsed. And come to find out, he had walking pneumonia. And they whisked him off to the hospital yet again. And he was hospitalized and he got better. But I think there was one other incident, which I don't remember right now. But I'll never forget, I was just a young kid when she said that to me, and I thought, oh gosh. But whatever he went through made him strong, because he worked for 42 years for the toll manufacturing company in Newburyport, and he had only 1 day of absence due to sickness. So whatever he went through made him strong. That's all I can say. But my grandfather had a 100-acre farm at the time there, and he had milk cows. And he had a milk route that it covered a lot of Newburyport. And he told me about High Street, and he told me he could remember almost every person's name on High Street. Now, it was late 20s when he bought the property, and then the Depression came. And he told me the story of delivering milk in Newburyport and people not being able to pay. And a lot of these people were on High Street, which was considered very prestigious. And he told the story of how one man, in desperation, his wife was ill, he didn't have money, and what he did was he dismantled his front hall staircase to burn it up and heat the house so his wife wouldn't suffer. He said, my grandfather said, people don't know how bad it was during that Depression. My dad later told me that their life on the farm during that time was quite good. My grandmother was a meticulous. This is Margaret Spalding. And she kept a beautiful house, and she made sure that my father and his two brothers always had clean clothes, neatly pressed before they went off to school. But every morning they had to go out and milk the cows first. So they'd milk the cows, come in, change, put on their clean clothes, and off to school they went. My dad did tell me that he felt bad for some of the kids in his class because they'd be milking their cows and coming to school in the same clothes. But at any rate, Dad, he did say that during the Depression that they did okay because they had plenty of food, and my grandfather had a livelihood. My dad, well, he met my mom because the school in West Newbury, the high school had burnt, and he went to Newburyport High, and Newburyport had allocated a section of the Newburyport High School for West Newbury students, so their teachers and the students could learn there. And that's when he met my mother. He used to offer her a ride home because he had a vehicle, and they got married. Mom was 20 and Dad was 25. And then a couple years later, that was 1950, Mom came home from traveling with him in the service and had me. And that house that she lived in was my grandparents', my father's parents' house, right on Rogers Street. And the front room, as you face the house to the left, was the room that my mother and I lived in until Dad came home from the service. This was during the Korean War, although he didn't go to Korea. But he came home, and Mom had bought a house in Newburyport for us, and that's when we moved out. So my roots are here, even though I only lived in West Newbury a year. And if you think about it, though, all my ancestors were in Newbury, Newburyport, and West Newbury. So, and that was all part of Newbury at that one time. So I grew up in Newburyport, and I didn't come back to West Newbury until when I married Scott in 1983. And he has lots of stories about where we live. He built our house on a corner of his family farm, and he can, I'm sure, tell you more about that. So I've been here now for 43 years. I can tell you already there's been a number of changes. I do remember going to Mass on a Sunday, on a day like this, and we decided to walk, and we'd go along. There was a path all along overlooking the river. It was, like a farm path. But we were able to walk from here. We passed one house. It was Ed Jarvis's house before we got to Whetstone Street. Now it's right across from the Food Mart. And then we'd walk up Whetstone Street and over to church. But we did not see another house other than the Jarvis's until we got to Whetstone Street. That was when we first got married. So it tells you how much West Newbury's changed in that relatively short, 40 years, but relatively short period of time. And the other part of this is, I told you that my mom had lived in West Newbury at my grandparents' farmhouse. And I grew up in Newburyport. And I was a member of the Immaculate Conception Church there. And when I received First Communion and confirmation, etc., got married, all that, all the paperwork always said that I was baptized in Newburyport. And one of the pastors at St. Anne's one day came up to me, I think it was Father Kelly. He said to me, he said, Jeannie, you were baptized in this church. And he must have known that I thought it was Newburyport Immaculate Conception, because he had the paperwork for when I got married in St. Anne's, and it would have said Immaculate Conception. But he looked into it, I guess, for some reason. He said, no, you were baptized right here in West Newbury, St. Anne's. So my roots go a little deeper already. I didn't know that until then. I said something to my mother, and she said, I don't remember that. So, and finally, I will say that this spot where we are, Scott and I have just 1.2 acres right here, but we are so fortunate that the farmland is preserved near here and won't be built on. And when our children were in high school and junior high, they ran cross country, for instance, and this was always used. The paths were used for them to run. And the school can still use these paths for that reason. Growing up, my father grew up here, as did his two brothers, and his two brothers stayed in West Newbury. So I have at the time of 14 cousins living in West Newbury. And my uncle, Dick, my father's older brother, actually owned the gas station in the center of town. So, we had reasons to come. My other uncle, Bubbles and Patty, they lived on Maple Street, and we would come. And I don't know that this exists anymore, but I can remember as a kid coming and using our belts to carry a bucket and using both hands to pick blueberries. And we would come back with buckets and buckets of blueberries. Everybody had a bucket of blueberries. And it was behind their house on Maple Street on a hill, which I have to wonder if there's still blueberries there or not. I don't know. But we spent a lot of time here, and we knew a lot of people here. My Uncle Dick, I can remember on the corner of Rogers Street and Garden Street, he built that house. And I can remember as a child, I can't believe they let me do this. They put down a ladder because the foundation was in and the floor was in and nothing else. And it hadn't been backfilled. And I walked across the rungs of the ladder to get to the flat. And that was the beginning of that house. And on that house, next to that house, is a garage. And the funny thing is that garage was owned by both sides of Scott and my family. At one time, Dick owned it. There were 2 bays matching. And then my Uncle Dick Spalding, had owned it too. So anyways, they split it in half, and Dick Berkenbush and Dick Spalding each took half of the garage, and they're both still existing. So I became quite close with Dr. Lois Rogers, who lived across the street. And she told me a story that I think needs telling. And I know she was born in 1917, and I know that she graduated from Yale Medical School, second in her class. And I heard that she had to be affiliated with a hospital, and she wanted to be affiliated with Anna Jakes and have her practice in this area. Unfortunately, they told her she could not be affiliated with the Anna Jakes because she was a woman. And the fact she was second in her class at Yale meant little to nothing. So she went to Beverly Hospital and then set up her practice in Topsfield, where she was very successful. And I believe she was 87 or so when she stopped practicing. She did that for years. I had my children here, as you know, and also my husband was on the call fire department from the time he was 18 until he was forced to retire when he turned 66. And I'm going to tell you the wife's side of this story, because I don't think people realize the sacrifice that call firefighters make, as well as their families. When I had my girls, Kate and Betsy, they were 20 months apart. And when they were still very, very young, my husband had this huge box that would go off when there was an alarm, and it was loud. And when the girls were still babies, someone was pulling false alarms quite frequently in the middle of the night. And the alarm usually was in front of what I call the old town hall, across from the library. And at that time, the police chief / fire chief was my father-in-law, Dick Berkenbush. And these alarms kept going off 1, 2, 3 in the morning. And what would happen is my husband would jump up, throw clothes on, run out the door, and I would have 2 screaming babies on my hands. And to say I was exhausted is an understatement. And I don't mean to make this all about me, but I'd have to calm them down. It would take a while, and then they'd go to sleep. And this was happening often. It wasn't unusual for it to happen 2 or 3 times in a week. And I went to my father-in-law and I said, can we please put something in the paper, get it out there that this is happening? And my father-in-law was a man of few words, and all he would say was, I don't think that's a good idea. So a lot of people didn't know about this. Well, one night it happened again. Scott ran out the door. And the next morning, very calmly at breakfast, I said to my husband, I said, you have a choice. Either you take that squawk box, that's what I called it, out of the window in our bedroom, or before I go to bed tonight, I'm opening the window and I'm pushing it out. And it was the window up high. And I said, I am not putting up with that anymore. And my husband just looked at me like, I can't believe she just said that. But anyways, off he goes. And there was a store over in Amesbury that supplied some articles for police, fire, etc. And he came home with this little device about this big that he was able to put under his pillow, and the problem was solved. Who knew? Who knew? But he knew, Scott did know I meant it. The other piece of this, though, is at that time, Scott ran his own business. He put in long hours, and he got up very early in the morning. And I don't think people realized how much sacrifice the call departments have, and also the stress of their job, because everybody knew everybody in town, and then there'd be an emergency, and it wasn't easy. So at any rate, Scott continued with the fire department until he was of age, and then he had to turn his badge in or retire it, whatever you do. And I was never so glad, and I don't think he was ever so sad, but that's how we felt about it. But I do have other things that were told to me about the farm on Rogers Street. At that time, in the 50s, Grammy and Gramp decided to sell the farm. They then moved down to Newbury and opened an antique shop, which they had for about 20 years. But when they were selling it, an agent for the buyer, it was Dr. Wells and his family who were buying it. The agent came by and perused everything, and he said to my grandfather, you do not have 100 acres here, which is what the deed said. And my grandfather said, I beg to differ with you. You go down to the bridge. This is on Rogers Street. There's a bridge over the artichoke. and you stand in the middle of the bridge and you look straight down and you will see a stone wall. I own to the stone wall all around, which was the back side of the farm. Well, the artichoke had been dammed up and flooded to make, a water resource for the town of West Newbury. The town of Newburyport. So when that was done, when Newburyport dammed up the artichoke, it filled up land, and there was no compensation. In fact, my grandfather still owned the land. And so this man was saying, he basically accused my grandfather of being not honest about the amount of acreage. And on top of that, not only did they simply take the land by flooding it, he had cows that were not allowed to go near the water. He had to supply the cows with water from a well and not go near that, even though he owned the land. He probably paid taxes on it too, I don't know. But this is still ongoing as far as the artichoke and the water in Newburyport and West Newbury. But my grandfather and grandmother really gave a lot towards that cause. And their poor cows could see the water, but they couldn't go near it. So I thought I'd add that because it seems timely for the times on that. And it was quite a debate, that's the word, I guess, at town meeting when my father-in-law wanted very much to preserve this land. He didn't want to simply have it left as is. He wanted it to still be owned by the family, and he wanted it to remain a farm, a working farm. And even though it's just the hay that they harvest now, but at that time, there was nothing in place law-wise to make this happen. What he did was he sold the development rights for the property for these, I think it's 18 acres. And he wanted to keep ownership of it and allow it to be farmed, whereas conservation, it would be just left to grow up and be treed or whatever. In order to get this to work, he had to go to the State House, and they had to draw up something that had never been done before. And then there was town meeting. Now, prior to town meeting, Dick came to Sandy, my sister-in-law, and Scott and I, and said, there's two options. It would either be sold for development, or we could try and do this plan that I just talked about. And so at the town meeting, they had to have a vote to approve by the town buying the development rights, which was $200,000. That was to be set up in an account that Dick managed and would help on the taxes. Now, because it would not be developed, the value of the land went down. But several people were saying, why should we try and solve this man's estate problems or whatever? And one of the select women at the time stood up and said, if you don't think this is a gift to the town, you don't know what it is. And I was so glad she said that. And there was another gentleman who stood up and said that he didn't know Dick Berkenbush at all, but he had taken the time to walk the property before this vote. And evidently he was in real estate. And he said, that property has got to be worth $4 or $5 million. So a vote was taken and it passed. The other piece that people didn't know was if it had been sold and money made, eventually that would have been split with Scott and Sandy. But we all agreed that we wanted to keep the land. And I say that because I don't think people realize the sacrifices people made and are continuing to make to keep West Newbury the way they do. Not everyone does it, but it's just an example of what this family did to try and keep a little piece of West Newbury. And people in town or anyone can come and walk these paths. Anyone's welcome. So
is that model that Dick came up with the model that West Newbury uses now to preserve open space?
I don't know for sure. I wonder if the Grant Farm, for instance, is one of them, because that state is, it's possible. I don't know the details of that, but I do know when Dick came up with this idea, nobody in Massachusetts had ever done it. So he really, truly did want to do the best for West Newbury. And the odd thing is, as many ties as there were for families, my husband knowing my relatives and so forth, and friends, Scott and I never met until 1979, and I'd never even heard his name. And but anyways, we ended up getting married in 1983. And I will say this one funny little thing. I was living in Natick at the time, and I had come home for the weekend. It was at my parents' house in Newburyport. My sister said, "Oh, you have to go to this party, Jeannie. It's going to be so much fun." I said, it's at Scott Berkenbush's. And I didn't know who Scott Berkenbush was. And I said, "Oh, I can't go. I don't even know him. I can't just show up." And she said, "Oh, everybody goes to his parties." So I came, I met Scott, and it turned out I knew half the people here. So that was the beginning. So, and now I feel like my roots are truly here. The other piece of it, I think I always knew I wanted to be in West Newbury, because when I was single, I had an opportunity to buy a piece of land in West Newbury, and my dream was to build a house on it. It was on the other side of town. As it turned out, we couldn't get a perk test on it, and the other thing was Scott begged me to not make him sell this house. He said, "Please don't." And I said, "Okay, we'll live here." And here we are. So and the other thing is, it has changed a little in that the road you came down, which is Chestnut Lane, was our driveway. And we were 19 Chestnut Street, changed 19 Chestnut Lane. And that changed when this lot sold and the house was built next door. And then the town took it over. And I have to tell you, I'm I was kind of glad because that was a lot. The mailbox was up there. We had to maintain that steep driveway, and now it's a town road, which is nice. Now we have a normal driveway. Well, Pentucket is on land, and I'm sure, other members of the family can tell you about this, but Pentucket was built on land that belonged to the family. This originally was called the Albertson Farm, and then Jean, the daughter, married a Berkenbush, and they called him Daddy K. And that stretch where the high school is, and now the junior high as well, over to close to where that brook is, where you walk over a little bridge, that was Berkenbush land, and or Albertson at the time. And someone went to Scott's great-grandmother and said, either you sell this to us or we're going to take it by eminent domain. They really didn't have a choice. They said, we've decided that's where the school's going to be. So she sold it. And, but they really didn't want to sell it. That was it was a working farm. That was where they did most of their plantings and so forth, although that type of life was changing, but that kind of finished that off. Yeah. But Hazel Albertson was very much a lady about it. I had read a letter one time, and she said that as much as they didn't want to sell it, it was going for a good cause to educate the children. So she was gracious about it. Yeah. And then it's certainly convenient having the school right here, because when my children were in junior high and high school, they just walked to school. And it became kind of a favorite drop-in place. As I told you, the kids cross country would run by, etc. And one time we had a exchange student from Germany staying here, Sarah. And Sarah said to me, I'm staying in the best house of any of them in West Newbury. And the reason she said that was she was walking distance to everything. And a lot of the kids, had to rely on somebody bringing them somewhere or whatever. But Sarah was thrilled to have stayed here. The Myopia Hunt Club would come through, right through here. And over in the distance, maybe Timothy can take a picture of it. There is a jump. It's well overgrown now, but it was a jump for the horses, and the horses would do that jump right there. And we did have a video of that. I don't know what happened, but the thing is, when it was getting all overgrown and everything, and starting to wear, I said to my father-in-law, to Dick, one time, I said, Dick, why don't you just take that down so you can just mow, etc. And he said to me, he says, no, he said, when I gave the Myopia Hunt Club permission to put that jump up, they promised me that when they were finished with it, they would take it down. And it's their jump and their responsibility. Well, they haven't used that as a jump in 30 plus years, and it's still there.
You should tell Deb Hamilton.
So
how come they stopped using this land for Myopia?
They stopped using this land when the development went in, because that was part of the, and now, well, you can walk by roads. I'm not sure you can get all the way through to Whetstone Street now, the way things have developed, which is fine. There's beautiful homes over there.